Welcome. In this video, we'll be covering verse 29 of Daniel chapter 11, and we're in the thick of the 6th Syrian war. So if you haven't watched the previous video, please do so. In the previous video, we finished on verse 28, in which Antiochus is unable to take Alexandria, so he returns home, leaving troops in Pelusium, so he's ready for his second attack. Okay, so what happens next in our story? Well, in verse 29, we read the following. At the appointed time, he, Antiochus, shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before. End quote. So Antiochus is going to attack Egypt again. So let's discuss the events that lead up to this second invasion of Egypt. Before we do this, however, I just want to remind you of the agreement between Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV, which we read about in verse 27. It reads, "The two kings, their minds bent on evil, shall sit at one table and exchange lies, but it shall not succeed, for there remains an end at the time appointed." End quote. So remember, in this agreement, both men are lying. Antiochus tells Ptolemy something along the lines of, "Let's go conquer Alexandria so I can restore you as king of Egypt." And of course, this is a lie. Antiochus has no intention of ever restoring Ptolemy as the king of Egypt. He wants to be the king of Egypt. And in response to this lie, Ptolemy VI says something along the lines of, "I trust you, Antiochus, and have no intention on going back to my brother and sister." We'll see in this video that this too is a lie. Let's now launch into the meat of this video, which is discussing the events that lead up to Antiochus's second invasion of Egypt. A very nice description of this time period is found in Livy, book 45, which reads, quote, "Antiochus was now master of the rest of Egypt, but after his check before Alexandria, he retired from its walls. The elder Ptolemy VI, whose restoration to his throne Antiochus pretended was his sole object in invading Egypt, was left at Memphis, and Antiochus withdrew his army in Syria, prepared to attack whichever brother should prove victorious." End quote. Before continuing, can I just quickly draw your attention to the phrase Antiochus pretended his sole object was the restoration of Ptolemy VI to the throne? This makes perfect sense of the phrase in verse 27 that they exchanged lies. So yet again, Daniel 11 hitting the nail on the head. Okay, let's continue to read Livy. Quote, "Ptolemy was quite aware of Antiochus's intention and hoped that by playing upon his brother's fears and holding out the prospect of a siege, he might possibly, with the active assistance of his sister and the acquiescence of his brother's friends, be admitted into Alexandria." What made Ptolemy VI suspicious of Antiochus was after handing over the rest of Egypt, he had left a strong garrison in Pelusium. It was obvious that Antiochus was holding the key of Egypt in order to make a fresh invasion whenever he chose, and for Ptolemy to engage in the intestine strife with his brother would prove to be to his ruin, since even if victorious, he would be no match for Antiochus after an exhausting war. End quote. So here we almost have the internal dialogue of Ptolemy VI. He realizes that Antiochus is up to no good. Even though he retreated back to Syria, he left troops in Pelusium, which means he's coming back to finish the job. Ptolemy also realizes that him fighting with his brother and sister will be to no avail, because even if he wins, he then has to fight Antiochus, and he knows that he's absolutely no match for Antiochus. So what is he going to do? Well, he realizes he needs to win back the trust of his brother and sister and be readmitted back into the co-kingship and be allowed to return to Alexandria. So Ptolemy begins sending messages to his sister asking to be reinstated as king and asking her to convince their brother to let him back into Alexandria. So we can imagine these letters saying something like, "I don't trust Antiochus. Please convince our brother to let me be king again and return to Alexandria." Livy writes concerning this, quote, "He, Ptolemy VI, began a correspondence with his sister Cleopatra and his brother's friends and continued to write to them until he had come to terms with them." So Ptolemy is sending all these letters to his sister, and in return, Cleopatra begins to urge their brother to let Ptolemy VI back into the group. So let's imagine Cleopatra saying this to Ptolemy VIII. "We should reinstate our brother as king and let him into Alexandria." Livy continues to write, These wise reflections met with the approval of his brother and his friends, and his sister helped him very largely by her advice and her appeals to the brother. So peace was made and he was admitted into Alexandria with everyone's consent. Even the populace manifested no opposition, though they had suffered severely both during the investment and the retirement of the enemy, as no supplies were being brought in from the rest of Egypt. End quote. So Ptolemy is permitted to enter Alexandria and join his siblings in ruling there. Now, if Antiochus was telling the truth and truly wanted to reinstate Ptolemy as king, this should have been great news to him. As Livy writes, quote, "This ought to have given the liveliest satisfaction to Antiochus had his motive for bringing his army into Egypt really been the restoration of Ptolemy, for this was the pretext he alleged in all his communications to the cities of Greece and Asia and all his replies to their deputations." Livy continues, "But Antiochus was so intensely annoyed at what had happened that he began to make preparations for war in much more aggressive and ruthless temper against the two brothers than he had previously shown against the one." End quote. And this is what verse 29 of Daniel tells us. It says, "At the appointed time, he, Antiochus, shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before." Livy continues to write, quote, "He at once sent his fleets to Cyprus, and in the first few days of spring set his army in motion for Egypt and advanced into Salil, Syria. When near Ranocula, he was met by envoys from Ptolemy, who thanked him for the recovery of his ancestral crown and begged him to protect the boon he had conferred and to say clearly what he wanted rather than attack him as an enemy by force of arms after being his friend. Antiochus replied that he would not recall his fleet or withdraw his army or any other conditions than the cession of Cyprus and of Pelusium and the surrounding country at the mouth of the Nile." End quote. Siao writes in his commentary about these events, quote, "Within the year, the Ptolemy brothers were reconciled and united in their opposition to their treacherous uncle. Antiochus again invaded Egypt, although it was not as it was before. Antiochus scored initial victories, but as he was preparing to attack Alexandria again, a Roman fleet suddenly showed up." End quote. So Antiochus's second invasion of Egypt will not be successful, as verse 29 says, "But this time it shall not be as it was before." And the reason why is because as Antiochus approaches Alexandria, he is met by the Romans. And this actually brings about a very historic moment in which Antiochus is put into his place and absolutely humiliated. I hope you join me for the next video in which we'll be discussing this event. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, your support would be greatly appreciated, so please consider supporting me on Patreon. Find the link in the description below. If donating isn't something you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button and leave a comment. Finally, make sure you're subscribed to get my next video. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.